All right, so good to be with all of you. Happy to have another opportunity to study with you. We're studying in the book of Acts, in Acts chapter 25, and I think we left off at about verse 8 last time. Would remind everybody we're having a Bible class, so everybody's free to ask a question or make a comment, even though I'm still standing up here in the same spot like I'm preaching. I don't think of it that way. Before we enter into our study, we want to go to our Heavenly Father for a word of prayer, and we'll ask Brother Nathan to direct our minds. Amen. All right. Always glad to see the screen come on. So we're looking at, again, the overall context here is Paul's last years as an apostle. He went back to Jerusalem, and there he was arrested and then imprisoned at Caesarea and had several trials there, and eventually will voyage to Rome. And when the book of Acts ends, he's finishing 2 years of prison in the city of Rome. And we'll study after the 28th chapter what happened to Paul after the book of Acts. And there's a lot of indication that from the prison epistles that Paul wrote, that he was released from prison. He got a good verdict in Rome. And had a period of time to travel again before he was rearrested. So he's had his trial now. We're studying his trial before Festus. He was originally tried before Felix, and Felix wanted to do the Jews a favor, trying to help himself out before Caesar, and kept Paul in jail for 2 years, just delayed his case. But then Festus became the governor in about 60 A.D., and he is now in charge, and Paul has had a trial before him that we've looked at, and the Jews tried to bring the same charges that they brought before Felix. They said that Paul had been a disturber of the peace and stirred up trouble among the Jews all over the world and at the temple, and that he had tried to defile the temple, and that he was a preacher of a new religion, basically the gospel. And then Paul gave his defense, and Paul pointed out that he had only been there in Jerusalem 12 days. And during that time, he had not caused any disturbances whatsoever before his arrest. He hadn't been stirring up riots or problems. It was some Jews from Asia that falsely accused him of bringing somebody into the temple, and really they ought to be there if there was going to be charges against Paul. So there's no evidence that Paul did these things, and he should be released. He is a Christian. He is one that preaches the gospel, but the gospel isn't a new religion. It's the fulfillment of the Jewish religion. It is the hope of Israel, actually accomplished, that Jesus Christ is the one that has fulfilled the old law. And so Paul's not doing anything that he should be imprisoned for. And after he arrived, we're told about the trial here. It says, after he had arrived, the governor comes to Caesarea. Paul's in custody there. Then they have the trial. After he had arrived, the Jews who had come down from Jerusalem stood around him, bringing many and serious charges against him, which they could not prove. While Paul said in his own defense, I have committed no offense, either against the law of the Jews, or against the temple, or against Caesar. There's no reason for me to be imprisoned. And Festus should have let Paul go, just like Felix should have let him go. But Festus, wishing to do the Jews a favor, he's wanting to start his new governorship off in good fashion. Felix had been accused by the Jews and removed from office. And here these religious leaders are wanting to try Paul and condemn him. And he doesn't want to start off on the wrong foot with these people he's ruling over. So he wants to do them a favor, do them a grace. And he is not being a fair judge. A judge should just weigh the facts, right? Justice should be blind. It shouldn't matter whether it pleases the Jews or doesn't please the Jews. It should matter, is it right or is it wrong? Is it just that Paul be in jail? Or is it unjust? And it is clearly unjust. But yet, he's going to try to get Paul to go to Jerusalem and stand trial again. He answered Paul and said, "Are you willing to go up to Jerusalem and stand trial before me on these charges?" Just think, you've reached the Supreme Court and they say, "Well, you want to go back down to Mustang and be tried on this thing again?" I've gone through the appeal process. I am at the right court. You guys should make a decision, right? If this is fair. You shouldn't send me back down to the people that treated me unfair already. But that's what he asked him to do. Well, you want to waive your rights, Paul, as a Roman citizen and go down there and let them try you? Of course not. I mean, that's an outrageous suggestion that he would do that. But it shows the judge is not going to be fair to him. But Paul said, "I am standing before Caesar's tribunal, where I ought to be tried. I have done no wrong to the Jews, as you also very well know." He's heard the case. They have no case. All right? They don't have any evidence. It's just a bunch of accusations. Don't you have to prove things in court? Actually prove that it happened? And Paul says they don't have any proof. I should be let go. What an outrageous suggestion that I should go back down to Jerusalem, where I had to come up here, right, because they were plotting to kill me. And we know they're plotting to kill him now. The whole reason they want him back in Jerusalem so they can kill him on the way. So in Paul's case, there's no reason for him to be in jail. He hasn't injured any person, property, anybody's character. And it just shows to Paul, I've been waiting for 2 years to get a fair judge. Now I don't have one again. So what's the only thing for Paul to do? It's appeal to Caesar. He got to go to another court, right? So the next verse. If then I am a wrongdoer or have committed anything worthy of death, I do not refuse to die. But if none of these things is true of which these men accuse me, no one can hand me over to them. I appeal to Caesar. So now Paul's got another 2 years at least. He's going to have to stay in jail till he can go before Caesar. But is it better to go and stay in jail another 2 years and maybe get released, or to be handed over to these murderers and be killed? Paul's going to take legal advantage of his citizenship and get legal protection to go before Caesar. It was the right of the Roman people back since 509 BC that you could appeal to the Roman people for justice if you didn't you didn't think you were getting treated fair in your local courts. That got changed over when the emperors, took over, and it wasn't a republic anymore. It was basically a dictatorship, that you could appeal to Caesar. They brought that over to the new system. And so that's what Paul does. And once you appeal to Caesar, then that stops all the proceedings. That court doesn't have any more say-so about you. You've got to be transferred to Rome as a Roman citizen to stand before Caesar. And so Paul has done that, and he himself is going to go stand before Caesar. So the Lord Jesus told Paul in a vision, didn't he? You will go to Rome. And so it hadn't turned out exactly the way Paul would have imagined, probably, I'm going to get to Rome. But he's going to get to Rome on government expense. They're going to bring him there as a Roman citizen, and he's going to have a trial, and he's going to stand before the ruler of the Western world, Caesar, and be able to make his case. So it's a pretty amazing thing, isn't it? That how the prayer was answered, how the care was provided, the providence worked out, that Paul's going to be sent to Rome. So you think about Paul, you think, I appeal to Caesar, and the Caesar is Nero. And what do we think of Nero? We think of Nero as one of the worst Caesars there's ever been, the first one to spill Christian blood, right? He is the first one to persecute the church. But he wasn't that way when Paul appealed to him. When I was getting my history degree in college, the thesis that I wrote for my bachelor's degree was on Nero. That was what I wrote the paper on. And the first 5 years or so of Nero's reign were great. Everybody thought he was the next Alexander the Great. He was the ruler they'd all been waiting on when Nero came to power. He had 2 wise men that advised him during that first 5 years. One of them was Seneca, the philosopher, and he helped him. He was a Stoic and helped him rule. And make proper decisions for the Roman people and so on. Burrus was another man that was the head of the Praetorian Guard, that was an excellent man and an excellent advisor. We see today, you can have a president maybe that doesn't have all of his facilities, but yet if his people around him are good, telling him what to do, that would be great. But if they're not, then you got a problem, right? It was the same way with the Caesar. Once he gets rid of these good advisors, the second half of his rule is horrible, right? He becomes selfish, and it's all about him, and he becomes a tyrant. But in the first of his reign, when Paul said, I appeal to Caesar, Nero was nothing but, a good guy to appeal to, evidently. But things do change over the years. And this is probably 59 or 60 when these events take place. You wouldn't have any knowledge about what Nero was going to do later. He builds his big golden house in the city of Rome at great expense, and he wants to clear more of the area of the city, and there's a great fire. And many people said, well, he set the fire himself in order that he could rebuild everything because he wants to build all of these glorious things. And Nero, to get attention off himself, said, no, it wasn't me. The Christians, they're the ones that burned the city. They started the fires because they think the world's going to burn up at the end, and they were starting it. And so the great persecution under Nero started. And it was probably just a political thing to try to get attention off himself that he treated the church the way he did. And of course, in that great persecution, the Apostle Peter and Paul were both put to death. And a number of other prominent Christians were arrested and put to death. Verse 12 says, Then when Festus had conferred with his council, he answered, You have appealed to Caesar you shall go. So, as a governor, just like we were talking about Nero having counselors, you got your expert lawyers and all of that on the laws of the Roman courts and government. And what do we do if somebody appeals to Caesar? Well, his lawyers come back to him and say, you got to send him to Caesar. That's it. That's the rule. Which this case is over. Now we'll just try to find transportation for him because he's got to go to Rome. So he appeals. The experts advise the governor, and Paul's going to go to Rome. That's where he has to go. You have appealed to Caesar you shall go. Well, I've talked a lot already. Has anybody else got a thought or anything you'd like to add to the proceedings here? Well, it's you have two stories. It's just like things we hear in the news today, where people have their theories about why something happened. Nobody knows for sure. Enemies of Nero afterwards would want to paint him as bad as possible, right? Because he had to commit suicide, and another Caesar took over. So I really don't know. I don't think anybody knows. You just like now, you read one paper and you read the other paper, and one of them's got one political bias, and that's the way history is. I certainly don't think the Christians did it. I don't think they did it, that's for sure. But it could have just been an accident, and then his enemies are using it against him, so he gets the blame off himself. Right? He finds a scapegoat to blame, and we know that. And that was the Christians. So now we've got some experts that come to visit the new governor. He just got in office. He's only been in office 10 days or so already. And so all of the local dignitaries are going to come see Governor Festus now that he's the governor. And here's an expert in the laws of the Jews and the ways of the Jews. He's got a Herod coming to see him. He is a man in charge of the temple, and in charge of the high priesthood is Agrippa II. And so if anybody ought to help him write a letter to Caesar about why this case is coming to Caesar, it would be Agrippa that could advise him. So it's good for Festus that he shows up here. It says, Now when several days had elapsed, King Agrippa and Bernice arrived at Caesarea and paid their respects to Festus. So 4 or 5 years before, Agrippa II had been appointed to be in charge for the Romans at the temple. So he made sure order was kept at the temple and everything functioned the way it should. And he also was in charge of who was going to be high priest. You know, he would select somebody from the high priestly family. If they didn't like whoever was in charge, they'd replace him. And that was Agrippa's job. So he knew all the high priests and the priestly family, and he knew all of those people that are accusing Paul. He knew the details about them. And he knew all of these different matters among the Jews that they would be arguing about with Christians and so on. He knew all of that. He knew all of the background. He'd been there his whole life. Agrippa and Bernice. Bernice is his sister. He's got two sisters. We talked about them before. There is Agrippa I is his father. He was struck by God, by an angel, eaten by worms and died. Remember, back in 44 A.D., he had beheaded James and arrested Peter and persecuted the church. And so now Agrippa II is grown up and he's in a position of power. He has a sister, Bernice, and then a younger sister, Drusilla, that is married to Felix. And Felix, of course, is left. He's out of power now. So, you know, one of the rumors that you read and you see in Roman plays that were written, different satires that were written, is that he was having an incestuous relationship with his sister. I mean, that's a shocking thing to think about, but that's what he was accused of a lot in ancient history, that these two have an inappropriate relationship that brothers and sisters shouldn't have. Now, whether that's true or not, we don't know. I'm just saying that was the Roman gossip, you know, that they would spread about them. And so this Bernice and Agrippa are very close because she has a husband and then she leaves that husband, she goes back to him. She has another husband, comes back to him. And then also, she's important in history in the sense that, you remember, Titus is the son of Vespasian that becomes emperor, and he's the one that destroyed Jerusalem. She's Titus's lover later and was going to be the wife of the Caesar. But all of these rumors about her, again, it could be political, see. They don't want her to be the Titus's wife, and maybe they made up some things. But anyway, she ends up not marrying him. It's too politically a hot potato, so he gets rid of Bernice and when he becomes emperor. But anyway, there's some other history that we have secularly about these two people. So he is somebody he can certainly ask, what do I do about Paul? Says, and while they were spending many days there, Festus laid Paul's case before the king, saying, there is a certain man left a prisoner by Felix. And when I was at Jerusalem, the chief priests and elders of the Jews brought charges against him, asking for a sentence of condemnation upon him. So this case obviously is on Festus's mind. Anytime you got a case that's going to go up from your court to Caesar's court, you want to make sure the Caesar's not going to look at this and go, what in the world is he sending this case to me for? You know, why didn't he handle this down there? Why did this man have to appeal to me? He just kicked out the governor before him. So I can see there'd be some pressure on Festus. I need to write a really good letter about why I've got this problem, and this case is coming to Caesar. I couldn't settle it here. So Agrippa, you know all about these things. These Jews, they wanted me to condemn him and execute him without a trial. That was the first thing they started asking me about when I got to town. They wanted Paul dealt with, right? And then they wanted to bring the trial back to Jerusalem. Well, we know they wanted to kill Paul on the way. That's the reason they asked for that. So just trying to please the subjects here, you know. What can I write to Caesar about this? So he states the facts pretty clearly here to Agrippa. It's kind of accurate, I think, most of the stuff there. Says, and I answered them that it is not the custom of the Romans to hand over any man before the accused meets his accusers face to face and has an opportunity to make his defense against the charges. And so after they had assembled here, I made no delay, but on the next day took my seat on the tribunal and ordered the man to be brought. Said, well, I told these Jews I can't just condemn people without a trial. We got to have a trial. He got to be able to, the Romans, we have standards. Isn't that kind of a slap at the Jews? Like, you Jews don't have any standards. But we Romans, if they were practicing the law of Moses, they'd have had all the same standards, wouldn't they? The law of Moses said you have to have a trial, and you have to have witnesses, and you have to be able to, face your accused and all that. But they didn't want to follow that with Paul. So it shows how you can be blasphemed by unbelievers, right? If you don't follow the law of Moses, right? That's what they were told. And here the Romans are looking down on them. Why, we Romans, we know how to have proper trial. Aren't we thankful that these things have come down to our time from the law of Moses and from the Romans' law? That's what our laws are based on. And that you get to face your accuser and you get to have a trial, and people can't just lynch you. You've got to be able to have a chance to defend yourself. All of that comes down from the Romans. And the Romans did require that trial. And he said, I tried to find out justice here, but he kind of hides his true motives, right? The Holy Spirit has revealed to us through Luke, he wanted to please the Jews, right? Now, that's the truth. But he's not going to say that. He's going to say, I was just trying to do everything fair. And Paul appealed to Caesar. Well, we know he really wasn't being really fair. He was fair, he'd let Paul go. But he's kind of disgusted with Felix. He left him here. When you say, if you were Festus and now you got this problem on your hands, why didn't Felix deal with this? He's left him in jail for 2 years and dropped this on me. So I can see a little bit of complaint in that too, that Felix left this guy over. And I've had the trial, and then he appeals to Caesar. Now what? And when the accuser stood up, they began bringing charges against him, not of such crimes as I was expecting, but they simply had some points of disagreement with him about their own religion and about a man named Jesus, whom Paul asserted to be alive. And you see how we didn't get the whole trial transcript before, because it didn't ever mention Jesus before in any of the stuff we've read. But Jesus was mentioned at the trial. So we just got like a little summary of what happened before Felix and Festus. But the name of Jesus had come up, and the resurrection had come up, and they had talked about that. So when you put all the accounts together, you learn a little bit more each time as you go along about what all was going on here. But he said, as a new Roman governor, and evidently he is not aware, Festus he doesn't know the ways of the Jews. He's a new man in town. He doesn't know about all these disputes over Christ. He doesn't understand any of that. So he was really expecting this Paul must have done something criminal. He robbed the temple or something. He wasn't thinking it was a religious dispute that they were having, and they wanted to kill Paul over. So I thought it would be some breach of the peace, sedition, atrocious crime. But that's not what they brought. Their charges all had to do with their religion. That's why they want to kill Paul and why they want him condemned. Paul says there's this Jesus, and Jesus is alive. What they all say he's dead. He got crucified. So you see, there was a whole discussion before Felix and Festus about, evidently, Paul gave witness about the resurrection, that Jesus is alive, and all of us as Christians, he's the fulfillment of the law. He is the way every Jew ought to be following Jesus, right? That's what all men on earth ought to be doing, is following Jesus Christ. He's the Lord of all. He's been raised from the dead. He's the fulfillment of the Jewish religion. But the unbelieving Jews, the Jewish leaders, they say, no, he wasn't raised from the dead. He's not the Lord. And so Festus is wondering, what do I do now? Well, Agrippa knows about these things. And so he certainly could advise him further, because he and his whole family have been there from the beginning of Christ and the Christ's ministry and all of those things. So, and being at a loss how to investigate such matters, I asked whether he was willing to go to Jerusalem and there stand trial on these matters. Says, I was just ignorant about all of this, so I thought I'd send Paul to Jerusalem. Asked him to go down there. No, he was trying to do a favor. That's the reason he said that. We know why. And but when Paul appealed to be held in custody for the emperor's decision, I ordered him to be kept in custody until I send him to Caesar. So here, Agrippa, you see the problem I've got. Now what do I do? because of ignorance, I wanted to send him down there. And again, he has now got to make arrangements to get Paul to Rome. The emperor, he says there, you see in verse 21, the word emperor is Augustus. And that is a term of that they use for emperor. It's translated in our English translation, emperor there. But it's the word August, and it's the idea of somebody that is reverend. It was often used in a religious context of somebody that you would worship. They didn't like the word. You remember Julius Caesar? He was that great general, conquered Britain and all of Gaul, France, and did all of those great things, and became a dictator, really, of Rome, although he wouldn't put that title on. And why did they assassinate Caesar? They assassinated Julius Caesar because he was trying to be a king, they said, right? And the senators, got together and killed him. So when his nephew, Octavius, became the emperor, he took this title, Augustan, and that became his name, Augustus Caesar. And then all of the Caesars after him used that same term. They didn't want to be called king because that got Caesar killed. So they didn't say king. They got a new term, August or Augustus. And so that's the term that's used here, and it's translated emperor. That was in 27 BC. They started using that as a title, and then it just got passed on. So Caesar was a family name at one time, but it becomes an official term just like Augustus. They all wear that title after that, even though they're not related to Julius Caesar anymore after the family finally loses its power under, I think it's, well, I forget exactly which of the Caesars the line ends with, but after that, they just kept the titles anyway. They were Caesar, even though they weren't related to Caesar. And I have in my notes there, it was Gaius, or Caligula was the last one actually related to Julius Caesar. So Gaius was the last of the Julian line. All right. So Agrippa said to Festus, I also would like to hear the man myself. Tomorrow, he said, you shall hear him. So I'd like to hear this Paul preach. And then I can maybe write something for you or help you to send a letter to Caesar. And wow, wouldn't you, if you were a Herod, Herod Agrippa, wouldn't you want to hear Paul? I would. I would really. Just think about his family history. Agrippa II, he's the last of the Herod line. When he dies, there's no more Herods. Just like there was no more of Julius Caesar's family after the death of Caligula. You have Herod the Great was his grandfather. He attempted to kill Jesus at Bethlehem when he killed the babies there. And then there's Herod Antipas was his uncle. He killed John the Baptist, and he tried Jesus and on the day of his trial, along with Pilate. And so he'd heard those stories, I'm sure. And then there's Agrippa I. His father had tried to suppress the gospel, beheaded James, put Peter in prison to please the Jews, hoping to kill him also after the feast. And then he was struck dead by God because of his arrogance and blasphemy. And so he's heard a lot of stories growing up about all of his relatives and Christ and the apostles and all of that. Now he can hear the Apostle Paul. Yeah, I'd like to hear this guy. I want to hear his story. So that would be a great thing. Boy, wouldn't you just... I'm thankful we got the books of the New Testament. We can read it. But wouldn't it be something to actually get to hear Paul preach and see him? And that's what he's going to do. He said, I'll bring him. We're going to arrange it, and tomorrow you're going to hear a sermon. Paul's going to come. And it really isn't a trial, is it? Because there's nothing they can do to release him. He's appealed to Caesar. It's really just Paul can just preach, right? And tell them the story about his life and the gospel and try to save them. That's what Paul's going to do. And so we have a terrific sermon then in chapter 26 that Paul's going to preach. I've had several pictures of these coins of Agrippa II. Here's some more coins with this image on there that you can see in different collections of coins that people have. So these are real stories. This is real people that we're dealing with here, real history when you read the book of Acts, the greatest history. Anybody else have a thought on these things you want to add? Awful quiet. All right, so that leads us then to the sermon here that's going to be preached in chapter 26, verses 1 through 23. Here you have Paul starts, as he always does, as a complimentary introduction to his lesson. He uses good tack, which we all should do, try to make the gospel favorable to people as best we can. And he tells about his Pharisaic background, that he was a Pharisee, the strictest type of Jew that there is. That he was one that formerly persecuted Christianity. He was the number one enemy of Jesus Christ and the church. And then he saw the Lord on the road, and it changed his life. The Lord had a mission for him to be an apostle and to preach to the Gentiles. And he's been living his life in obedience, his whole life to God the best he can. And now he's doing his best to do what Jesus told him to do. That's the reason he got arrested and why he's standing there in chains, is because he's serving the Lord. And he's continuing to teach his doctrine. And so let's look then at the introduction here, verse 1. And Agrippa said to Paul, "You are permitted to speak for yourself." And then Paul stretched out his hand and proceeded to make his defense. This is mentioned several times about Paul, that before he started preaching, he would, somehow or another, he had a gesture that he would do, and then he would start his speech, his sermon that he would preach. And so he preached with his hands. It's like a lot of us talk with our hands. He stretched out his hand and began to give an orderly defense of why he was a Christian and why he does what he does. And addresses it to Agrippa. Agrippa's the one that called the hearing, and it's all to Agrippa. He said, "Oh, King," he's going to speak to him directly, even though there's probably a big crowd of other people there. He speaks directly to Agrippa, his words. And Agrippa, when he stands up, that's what ends the whole meeting, and they all file out. So Agrippa's in charge of this thing, and Paul's talking to him. Whoa. We got, as it mentioned, the third account here of Paul's conversion. It's like we have the four Gospels and the story about the resurrection and the life of Christ and all. It's good to have those four things, and as you put the witnesses together, you get a little new facts each time, that weren't added by the other Gospel. And you put it all together, you get such a fuller picture. We have Luke's account of Paul's conversion in chapter 9. Paul standing before the crowd in Jerusalem, and he emphasized certain facts for the Jews. Now he's talking to King Agrippa, and he tells the same story again, but he adds, again, other facts that aren't mentioned in the other accounts. So you learn more and more as you read through the book of Acts about Paul's conversion and how this all happened and what all took place on that day. So there's fascinating things in this account, although we've heard it twice before. It's still, you have a lot of good added information that is given, supplemental details. Verses 4 and 5. So then, all Jews know my manner of life from my youth up, which from the beginning was spent among my own nation and at Jerusalem, since they have known about me for a long time previously, if they are willing to testify, that I lived as a Pharisee according to the strictest sect of our religion. Now, I could say that about everybody in Oklahoma. All people in Oklahoma know about Billy Davis, but Paul could say that, evidently. Right? He was such a well-known person, even before he became a Christian. He was like the number one scholar among the Jews. He was Gamaliel, the great rabbi of that generation. He was his number one student, was Paul. So all the Jews knew about me. When you saw Gamaliel, I guess you saw Paul. And so Paul was very important before he became a Christian. He's the one put in charge of the persecution, right? He is the chief sheriff or whatever to go hunt down Christians. So all the Jews know about my background. And they know I used to be totally 100% all in for what they believe. So he's going to give his background. Now, why in the world did I change? He's going to show why he changed. Why he's standing there and they hate him now and are opposed to him. Because he used to be on their side. He used to be with them 100%. And he got his training early on. He came as a youth, it says. So sometimes probably as a teenager, he left. He was born in Tarsus of Cilicia to a father who was a Pharisee. And he came down here to get his education in Jerusalem. And he studied at the feet of Gamaliel, he tells us. He was a zealous student for the law. We can read about some of this in Galatians 1, about Paul's background. And he surpassed all of his contemporaries in learning about the history of the Jews in the Old Testament and knowing about all their traditions that they had. Paul knew that. He was the number one scholar at that time. And then these Christians came along, and Paul thought he needed to do all he could to persecute them. And he did so. But he was a Pharisee, and Agrippa would know a Pharisee is the strictest type of Jew. He dedicated to the law of Moses and following all the elders' traditions, enforcing every ceremonial law and tradition they've got. The Pharisees were the ones that always were the biggest sticklers to do that. And so that was Paul, very zealous for the Old Testament. So how in the world could he be on trial now? He's this terrible blasphemer that went up and desecrated the temple, and that doesn't fit with who Paul is and who everybody knew that he was. I think maybe we're about to go. All right, I think we'll stop there and come back and look at the persecution that Paul talks about here next. I see little ones back in the back. Appreciate your good attention.